50 years ago, in Los Angeles, California, in the Ambassador Hotel, Senator Robert F. Kennedy of New York, who was running for the 1968 election, was assassinated at midnight. And this is actually this is a sad story, along with many of the sad stories in 1968, because 1968 was a rough year for the United States, and this assassination added to that. Like a few months prior, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and it seemed like he was going to carry the torch for not only him but his brother John F. Kennedy, who was also assassinated. This, but this was also sad because the hope of he was kind of like the last hope of 1968, and once he was gone, there was the supporters of him had nowhere else to go, and he had potential. Now, this video is going to focus on what if he was never assassinated. So, this is what I think would have happened had he not been assassinated. So, Robert F. Kennedy was running for the 1968 election, and although he was a late entry, he was getting lots of votes. And getting lots of supporters. He was a growing force in the 1968 election. Other candidates were probably not going to stand a chance. And he had this growing buildup of support by just walking out and going to rallies and stuff and trying to get support by lots of people. And what he wanted was he was against the war, but he also wanted to help the poor. So he was like a package. He kind of wanted to end the war, just like everybody else. He was against the war when he ran for the 1968 election, and he also wanted to help the poor because he sympathized with them. He also wanted to help bring more equality, but also put in a law and order where the country would be in order. But he also liked to bring back respect for the presidency. So he won the California primary, but then a few minutes later he was shot in real life. But in this universe, since he won the primary, that means he would go to the Democratic convention in Chicago. Now, this would be a real challenge because one of the biggest threats was Hubert Humphrey. Another challenger was Eugene McCarthy, who had beat him in a primary, which was one of the Kennedy's biggest defeats, or actually no, first defeats in the election wise. So he had to go against them, and I believe he would take down Eugene McCarthy because Kennedy was the person with a lot more to him than Eugene McCarthy did. So there's that, but Hubert Humphrey is a tough one because the Democrats, because Lyndon B. Johnson, who was president, wanted Hubert Humphrey to be president. So he would try to get the Democrats to support him. But the people, many people, supported Robert F. Kennedy. He was the growing force, like I said. So that means it would have been a lot tougher for Hubert Humphrey to win the nomination, and I believe he would have lost the nomination because Hubert Humphrey was tied to Lyndon B. Johnson in his administration and tied to the Vietnam War, which is why this 1968 was a worse year because of protests and riots and all that. They would vote for Kennedy. Kennedy would have won the nomination, which means he would have won the nomination. He would have been the Democratic nominee, and Hubert Humphrey would have lost because Kennedy had a lot more support than Humphrey did. So that's what I believe. But now we go on to Nixon, and this would be a bit of a challenge, but I believe Kennedy would have took him out because when his brother John F. Kennedy ran against Nixon in the 1960 election, it was a close race. But the reason many people voted for Robert Kennedy or supported him was also because he represented what what would come from the Kennedy presidency, because the Kennedy presidency was what people wanted again, because they had this respect for who was assassinated, and they lost that respect because Lyndon B. Johnson took them to war. So there was that. So that would mean that many people would probably support Kennedy over Nixon, despite him being a Democrat, which was one thing that could have hurt his chances of running. But because the Democrats were kind of responsible for the Vietnam War, but Kennedy was against it, which would not work against him, which means he would have probably won the 1968 election. I just don't see Nixon winning the 1968 election if Kennedy ran. If Kennedy won the nomination, not been assassinated, won the nomination, he would have won against Richard Nixon because he was less controversial and he was more loved. He was a more loved person. He was a very nice. He was becoming a very nice guy. And although Nixon was kind of like a nice guy, Kennedy seemed more relatable than Nixon, which would have been one big problem. And he would have had this bigger appeal than Nixon did. So Kennedy would win the nomination, and win the presidency. And then there's the presidency part. I believe Robert F. Kennedy would have worked as hard to get the Vietnam War done, and I feel like he would have ended it earlier than Nixon did, who was able to get a ceasefire in 1973 after Nixon won re-election. So I believe Kennedy would have been able to end the Vietnam War more earlier because the reason it took so long for Nixon was because he wanted to end it in a way that the U.S. wouldn't feel humiliated later. It was kind of more like a ego thing. Like he didn't want to be the first president to badly lose a war because this was technically the first war the U.S. lost. So Kennedy would have done it much quicker because I think the people demanded it, and I think he would have listened to the people. Most of the people have spoken, so he would have ended the Vietnam War. And many of the violence that came during the Nixon administration during the Vietnam War would have ended would have probably not have had much violence, like the Kent University tragedy would have probably never happened. Now, it would have ended in his first term. I don't know when, but I think it would have been more earlier. Because peace talks were kind of a bit hard to do, but I think he would have made lots of peace talks, and he would have been able to end it. Now, another issue is like civil rights and all of that other stuff. Now, I believe Kennedy would have spoken out against racial inequality, and I think he would have probably tried to pass some laws to prevent more racial inequality. But I also think he would pass some laws that would also stop try to stop riots and all of that. He wanted to stop that because he sympathized with the African Americans and movements for justice and equality. But I don't think he would have not been pleased with the riots that have been going on. So that's what I believe. And I also believe that Kennedy would have also helped with the poor, because the poor were having a tough time because of the Vietnam War. So Kennedy would have got what the Poor People's Campaign wanted. They wanted the Poor People's Bill of Rights, which would have helped, which was basically in a nutshell help fund and get them jobs and all that. And Kennedy would have probably been able to demand it, and if they couldn't, he would at least pass some poor people laws to help them. And I think he would have tried to use the government to aid them and to help get them back on top again, help them reach the higher levels. And he very sympathized with them, so I think he had a chance. He has a chance to do that. Now another big issue is, I think, the recession. And personally, I don't. The recession came in later, after the Vietnam War. So the recession wouldn't come, but it could have came. The recession would have came, but it would have been less. It would have been less badly than the recession that came in our timeline, because the Vietnam War ended and some of this other stuff, the recession would have not been as bad as it is now. And personally, I think Robert F. Kennedy would have won the election, and maybe in a landslide like Nixon, because if he uh, if he had won the nomination, and I believe that he would have, because if he got them everybody out of the Vietnam War and had all these programs and stuff and all this other stuff, I believe he could have had a bigger landslide than Nixon did. And I think they would like carry like one state and they would lose DC. Because in our timeline, when he ran against George McGovern won, I think, Massachusetts and DC. Here, they won some other state, but but they don't win DC, which would have been a big landslide. But depending on what state it is. But that's what I think would have happened. And yeah, I see him winning his second term, and I see him working more harder than ever, and I think he would have been a great president because he knows how to be president because he was like a co-president with John F. Kennedy, his brother, and some people would joke he's the vice president or that he is the second most powerful man in the world, not Johnson. But that's where I see, and I also see Kennedy living through the legacy and seeing the legacy of Kennedy like being greatened because of the moon landing. That would have happened during his presidency, and I see that happening. And I see some of the other bad stuff that happened to the Kennedys not happening, like Chappaquiddick and all the other stuff. That would have probably not happened. And I see, and I don't, and this Kennedy not getting assassinated would have also helped Ted Kennedy because he wouldn't have had this much pressure and wouldn't have had these problems that he had in his personal life if Kennedy had not been assassinated. And he would have continued to be senator, and he wouldn't have all this pressure put on him. And I think the Kennedys would have been much better than they have been in the next 2 years. So that's what I think would have happened if Robert Kennedy had lived. And I hope this teaches you guys about something, but like although his assassination